Hello, my name is Malcolm Johnson, and I am presenting Anguillid Specters of Lutruwita. Before beginning, I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which I speak. The Palawa or Pakana people of Lutruwita have a deep spiritual, cultural, and ecological connection to the island, and despite the brutal forces of invasion, continue to care for land and sea country. I acknowledge the importance of elders, past, present, and emerging in their continued custodianship of the island, and I support calls for reconciliation for the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and all Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples wronged by colonization. In this talk, I explore the weird spectral realities of freshwater eels, specifically that of the short-finned eel, Anguilla australis, and their ability to reframe conceptions of otherness in a coastalscape rife with absence and presence. Particularly, I consider how eels uncover and are uncovered by understandings of deep time, the Tasmanian Gothic, post-colonial hauntings, and more than human entanglements. Julie Goff, in reflecting on her artistic practice, states that what has gone before may not be lost forever. There are traces and threads that can be twined again. That what once seemed blurred and indistinct is slowly coming into focus. This act of deblurring, of moving through place and reflecting on untellable histories, can be both a methodological practice and a reflection on eels, not simply as a species amongst many in an objectively observable world, but as an animating forces that have always reminded us that we are not alone in this world. Drawing from natural histories, geographical imaginaries, and dark ecologies, I begin the presentation by outlining how these frameworks reveal how the lutruwita coastalscape and the role they play in informing my methodological approach towards deblurring freshwater eels. I then describe and employ two methodologies, one emerging and one hybrid, to develop a series of allegories seemingly about eels in lutruwita, thus answering the question, what if eels were more than just specters hidden in murky waters and on page margins? The natural histories of lutruwita, drawing from Thomas Fleischner's definition of natural history as a practice of intentional focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, begin before the island's separation from the mainland at the end of the last glacial period. Dolerite cliffs give way to fog-covered alpine heathlands, each remnant of glaciers past. The towering temperate rainforests and their eucalypt and fern fade into button grass plains, most likely spread through the traditional burning practices. And the granite coastline opens up to kelp forest and rocky reefs, relentlessly battered by the currents propelled by an oceanic climate. While the island's isolation fueled a diversity of species, from the deciduous Nothofagus to spotted handfish, it was the solitude of 500 generations experienced by Tasmanian Aboriginals that most clearly distinguishes lutruwita. It is no surprise, then, that the material and discursive construction of lutruwita is built on a collection of often opposing geographical imaginaries. Using definitions from the likes of Gregory, Lahorn, and Said, geographical imaginaries are ways that people perceive of places, which help shape attitudes of the more than human while vitally implicated in the cultural and political understandings of place. This pluralistic approach is particularly attuned to the ongoing decolonial and anti-colonial movements in geography, which seek to resist the settler colonial knowledge practices that have dominated the conventional ways of recording the natural world, especially through natural sciences and cartographies. These opposing imaginaries are most clearly visible in the early histories of lutruwita, where the colonizers' belief in terra nullius not only gave space for the near genocide of the Aboriginal Tasmanians, but allowed for widespread manipulation of the ocean and coastal ecological communities, introduced salmonoids, drowned forests, heavy metal tailings, market exceptions. Here, I am interested in Timothy Morton's dark ecology, the practiced mindset that is attuned to the weird, ugly horror of ecological reality that compels compassionate coexistence. It is often described as a process of exposure to the unfamiliar that may prompt new ways of relating to the more than human world. Rowe and Lyons have likened this approach to that of Haraway's inventive practices that engage in creative explorations of serious environmental problems. In the case of freshwater eels and lutruwita, this means engaging in intractable questions around baseline datasets, competing interests, and the agency of watery species. As will be made less murky, the possible futures for the Anguillid specters are dark sweetness. Can they reveal Aboriginal knowledge? Do they stand in the way of green growth? Will we know where they traverse to? Have they already collapsed? The method of inquiry I use to explore these questions here is poetic carpentry. I've described this method elsewhere as a mix of Heideggerian poetics and Bogo's carpentry. This approach runs parallel to the well-established methodologies like geopoetics, deep mapping, and fictocriticism. Poetic carpentry is less of a nuanced way of encountering the animate world and more of a reframing of the difficulties and opportunities of recording spectral places and the more than human objects that comprise them. It is, in essence, a creative measure-taking of das Schweissen, or the between, that creates things such as altered maps and semi-fictitious stories that explain the embodied realities of place. This speculative world-making de-blurs the distinction between absence and presence to reveal the traces and threads that comprise the untold and unknowable experiences of freshwater eels in lutruwita. The remainder of this presentation involves 4 interrelated allegories about the Anguillid specters of lutruwita. The following content is based on historical texts, including old newspapers and colonial journals, conversations with Aboriginal Tasmanians, as well as with scientists across the island, an extensive literature review of what turned out to be a limited academic research on lutruwita's eels, and an ongoing creative dialogue with my collaborators on a larger project related to eels. From sea to river and river to sea, this is the journey of the eels. Bursting through membranes into total darkness, the very first Anguillid rose from the sea floor and began a perilous journey. At first, drifting unconcerned. Then, planktonic bodies metamorphosized into a torrent of sea leaves, pulled endlessly towards somewhere unknown. They turn round before reaching brackish edges, next opaque as they move upriver and waterfall. Some 30-odd years pass amongst reed, muck, and mud. At last, an irresistible calling back to the sea is felt as the eels lose their ability to eat. Months go by, swimming vigorously against currents and tides to reach the place of beginnings, only to spawn and die. In the ocean cradle of birth and death, the eel's cyclic journey begins anew. 50 to 100 million years ago, the ancestral eel expanded their voyage to newly carved streams on continents drifting north and south amongst a vast ocean. Landscapes are weathered, ice ages come and pass, and many other species evolve only to go extinct. Yet the eels, with their fate of swimming thousands of kilometers from sea to rivers only to return and perish, continue to persist. Even as lutruwita begins to come into its own, carved by glaciers themselves eventually turning into foggy ghosts, the space-time scales begin to collapse. The eels still occupy what seem to be all of the island's lakes, rivers, and ponds, while elsewhere, other ancestral eel descendants faced ecological ruin. But here, in this place at the bottom of the world, after all of the continental drift and pesky climate variability, the eels continue to avoid the terror of deep time by hiding from the human minds. Tens of thousands of years ago, the earliest people of lutruwita crossed the land bridge and, presumably, encountered the native eely inhabitants for the first time. But many mysteries remain from these ancient times. Most notably, from the moment the first colonizers contacted the Tasmanian Aboriginals, a story was woven of their complete lack of interest in eating fish of any kind. The idea was reinforced a century later based on nascent archaeological records demonstrating hundreds of years worth of proof that fish, including eels, were absent from the diets. In interviews from the early 1900s, contrary anecdotal evidence of eating fish did arise, as well as a more plausible reason for the refusal to accept gifts from the European invaders. Similarly, could it be that those very colonizers wanted to paint the Aboriginal Tasmanians in the worst possible light? In Nicholas Shakespeare's 2004 novel, In Tasmania, he writes that there is the Tasmania light, and then, all over the island, they are pockets of extraordinary darkness. Even if the Aboriginal Tasmanians of the time were well versed in catching and spearing eels, they were brutally murdered across the island, leaving much of their knowledge asleep, a term used to describe traditional knowledge that is no longer in practice. All stories of lutruwita, from those before Cook's first arrival up through today, are related to those unspeakable histories. And so, the eels have awakened from what very well may have been a 30,000-year connection to the people of lutruwita into a pantheon of, as Tasmanian Aboriginal and scholar Greg Lehman would say, great tragedies like the thylacine, Lake Pedder, and the ongoing struggle to save Tasmania's ancient forests. The colonial history of lutruwita is very eely. Bringing with them an obsession from Europe, the colonizers were quick to assess the potential value of eels. At first, the species would appear in advertisements for freshly caught eels, primarily from Mrs. Axford and their farm up in Bothwell. Then, if one was looking to buy a large property, it wasn't uncommon to see mentions of ponds abundant with eels. But the obsession didn't stop there. For some 100-odd years, people would write into their local paper about the 28-pound eel they caught in the Derwent, or how to properly skin an eel as to not cause it any serious distress, and that they could have sworn the indistinguishable body pulled from the lake must have been eaten by the Anguillid inhabitants. Even as the fishery industry was established, with their shipping of eels all the way to London, the interest was still omnipresent, until it wasn't. The eels of that time have a disruptive presence. They, like most of lutruwita's colonial past, seem to haunt the present with a kind of murky awareness. Eel fishing industries, the massive kind that package and ship them across the globe, are now in their 6th generation of family ownership, account for millions of dollars in revenue, and may very well be the source of the next eel you eat in the UK or Japan. But this fact alone is elusive to most. Just as we know why so much of the landscape of lutruwita was primed for sheep and cattle, forgetting is an integral part of the island's identity. Like Homi Bhabha's furious emergence of the projective past, the eels only seem to appear from their obscured state when they wash up on the shoreline, chopped to bits by the towering hydropower dams, bringing literal light to the dark island. In 1916, the first major hydroelectricity dam was switched on in lutruwita. While an extraordinary occurrence at the time, the human entanglement with dams on the island is fraught. They are simultaneously the key to lutruwita's standing as a fully electric-powered state, and the main source of ecological distress leading to the formation of the world's first Green Party. Yet neither of these understandings of the structures ever grappled with the Anguillid realities connecting the lakes, rivers, and ponds of the island to oceans and lands far away. But by the time of that first ribbon cutting, interest in eating eels had waned across lutruwita, while the fishery industry at the time boomed to meet demand overseas where other eel populations were in decline. Declines that show no signs of reversing despite decades of conservation efforts, due largely in part to dams. Eels haunt dams, just as the eels are haunted by dams. A few years ago, a bypass was built in one of the largest dams in lutruwita, not specifically for the benefit of eels, but to prevent all of the stoppages caused by eels chopped up in the turbines. Celebrations were had as the first eel shot out of the other side to make it downstream, but they were short-lived. As it turned out, the 6th-generation eelers depended on the fish getting trapped behind the dams for their industry. And when someone a few weeks later found several battered eels on the shores below the dam, it became clear how entangled the eel ecologies are with lutruwita, its histories, the coasts and oceans, and global systems driving so many things towards extinction. There are Anguillid specters everywhere in lutruwita. Their haunting draws us into a reality, not based on baseline data or neatly measured maps, but, as in the words of Avery Gordon, One experienced as an atmosphere or moment of recognition that eels delineate both the past and the future of the island. Marcus Clarke's Weird Melancholy of Australia is on full display as the eels, in their 50 millionth traversal from sea to river, begin the journey back, only to die caught in the spinning turbines of a dam touted as the solution for all of our climate change woes. The eels no longer exist as otherworldly specters in newspapers. Absent are the stories of 12-foot-long eels mimicking submerged trees. Yet, there are still traces and threads of the aquatic species, offering uncomfortable reflections of both the more than human relations or of Edward Collis's Tasmanian grotesque. In childhood memories of catching eels, in the continued search for their spawning ground, in the hidden reality of the eel fishery industry, or in the unknowing of that time before colonization. Rowe and Lyons, in reflecting on their own eel project, remind us of the importance of harnessing the darkness and violence of our relationship to other species, and that rather than allow them to remain hidden, we must engage with realities of ecological destruction in creative forms, as suggested by the likes of Morton and Harley. In crafting the four allegories, with their altered maps, weird stories, and synthographic images, I aim to de-blur the Anguillid specters of lutruwita, even if just for a moment. In pursuing these methodologies, my personal connections to place, ocean, community, and eel have been revealed in unexpected ways. Every rivulet walk is an opportunity to reflect on eely absence and presence. Every conversation a chance to reveal more than Anguillid relations. Even if destined for endangerment, like most other eels, they will always find a way to haunt the lutruwita land, coast, and seascapes. Thanks for your time. Before signing off, I want to also thank UTAS and the Center for Marine Socioecology for research funding, as well as Arts Tasmania for funding the eel music arts science project that this research has contributed to. If you're interested in hearing more about lutruwita's eels, check out Where Water Meets on the socials, where we will be sharing videos of our eel performance featuring the world's only eel instruments. Thanks for listening.